HOA called the cops to my house. Their faces dropped when they saw my wife in uniform. It started like any other day. I had no idea what was coming. Then, the knock at the door. 2 officers standing there, with a paper in their hands. A complaint from my HOA. But this wasn't about a lawn, or a mailbox. No, it was about something much bigger. Then, my wife walked into the room. But she wasn't in her usual clothes. She was in uniform. And the officers, they froze. What happened next? Well, that's where things took a turn you wouldn't believe. Welcome to HOA Secrets Uncovered. I'm Mark, and today's story is one you won't want to miss. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everything seems perfect on the surface. But beneath that facade, well, it's a different story. I've been dealing with my HOA for years, but nothing prepared me for what happened when they called the cops to my house. I'm just an ordinary guy, until my wife stepped in. But I'll save the details for later. Sit tight. This story is about to get wild. It was just another quiet afternoon, or so I thought. I was lounging on the couch, flicking through the TV channels, trying to escape the endless noise of HOA newsletters that had piled up on the counter. Honestly, it had been a while since I'd actually paid attention to any of those notices. Most of them were filled with ridiculous rules about fences, mailboxes, and lawn height. Same old, same old. But then it happened. Knock, knock, knock. A sharp knock at the door. Not the kind of knock you get from the friendly delivery guy or your neighbor asking to borrow sugar. This one was different. It had a certain urgency to it. Something about the rhythm of it made me feel uneasy. I got up, rubbing my eyes, still groggy from the mid-afternoon slump. I opened the door, and there they were. 2 uniformed officers standing at my doorstep. Their faces were serious. Almost too serious. They didn't look like they were here for a friendly chat. One of them looked at me, glanced down at the paper in his hand, then back at me. "Are you Mr. Johnson?" he asked, his voice low and official. I nodded. "Yeah, that's me. What's going on?" He shifted his weight, glancing at his partner who was standing a few steps behind. Both of them were scanning the house like they were looking for something, or maybe someone. "We're here because of a complaint. From your HOA," the officer said. The moment he mentioned the HOA, my stomach dropped. I knew something had to be wrong. There was always something going on with them, whether it was the mailman getting a warning for his improper parking or a neighbor getting fined for using the wrong shade of blue for their front door. I was tired of dealing with them, but this was different. "A complaint? What kind of complaint?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my voice cracked just a little. The officer handed me the paper, and that's when I saw it. The words "violation notice" were written in bold, almost mocking letters. I scanned the paper, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make sense at first. There were all kinds of rules listed on the paper, but none of them seemed to be about anything important. There was a violation for the height of the grass in my backyard, though I swear I'd just mowed it yesterday. Another one for the paint color of the fence. My fence, mind you, that had been standing there for years, with no complaints. The HOA had suddenly decided it was too drab or dull for their taste. But the thing that stood out the most? A notice about the mailbox. Apparently, the mailbox was 1 inch too high. 1 inch. I stared at the officers, holding the paper in my hand, feeling my frustration build. "Wait a minute. You're telling me that the HOA called the cops because of a mailbox that's 1 inch too high?" The officers looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable. One of them shifted from one foot to the other, clearly unsure of how to respond. I shook my head. This was insane. Who calls the cops for something like this? But then I remembered something. Just last week, the HOA president had sent out a notice about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. I'd rolled my eyes at it, thinking it was just another power trip, but I didn't think they'd go this far. I felt a mix of anger and disbelief, but I couldn't just slam the door in their faces. They were doing their job after all, even if their job was based on the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. "Look," I said, trying to stay calm. "This is just ridiculous. I'm not going to fix a mailbox that's an inch too high. Tell the HOA that. They've been harassing me for years now, over nothing." The officer gave me a half-hearted nod, as though he understood, but he didn't seem to have much choice in the matter. But just as I was about to close the door, something unexpected happened. I heard footsteps coming from behind me. It was my wife. I had no idea she was home, but there she was, walking toward us from the hallway. She was in her uniform, her police uniform. Now, this wasn't a casual thing. My wife had been a cop for over a decade. She didn't wear her uniform just because she felt like it, but there she was, walking into the room, her boots clicking on the floor with every step. The officers' faces froze. I saw their eyes widen, and for a second they just stood there, as if time had stopped. "Is there a problem?" my wife asked, her voice calm but with a hint of authority that made both officers take a step back. One of them hesitated, looking at her, then at me. Ma'am, we're just here on a complaint from the HOA." My wife didn't give them a chance to finish their sentence. She walked up, to them, her badge shining in the light, and flashed it. She didn't even say a word. The look on their faces was priceless. It was like they had just walked into a trap they didn't know existed. "Don't worry, officers," she said, a small smile forming on her lips. "I'll take care of this." The tension in the room thickened. The officers were no longer the ones in control, and somehow I knew things were about to get a whole lot more interesting. But what exactly did my wife have planned for them? And what was the HOA's next move? Do you think the HOA had any idea what was coming their way? Or did they underestimate how far someone would go to fight back? The officers stood there, almost frozen, as my wife casually flashed her badge. For a second, I wondered if they even knew what to do. They had come to my house, expecting some regular homeowner who would panic and comply. They hadn't expected a police officer in uniform, standing in front of them, with a calm smile that made them feel like they were the ones being questioned. "Ma'am, we didn't mean to cause any trouble," one of them mumbled, clearly uncomfortable. My wife didn't even acknowledge the apology. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the HOA complaint in my hand. "You know what this is about, right?" she asked, her voice almost too casual. I nodded, holding up the paper with the ridiculous violation notices. "Yeah, apparently our mailbox is too high and the fence isn't the right shade of beige," I said, sarcasm dripping from my words. "Oh, and the grass? It's probably an inch too tall, heaven forbid." My wife's face twitched into a smirk, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she looked back at the officers, her gaze cold now. "You know, officers," she said, her tone turning serious, "I've been a part of this community for a long time, but I've never seen a situation where the HOA felt the need to involve law enforcement over such trivial issues." The officers shifted uncomfortably, but neither one of them said a word. "You know, I was just getting off my shift," my wife continued, her eyes glinting now, "and I'd love to know how the HOA plans to handle this situation." One of the officers, the younger one, finally spoke up, his voice shaky. "We're just doing our job, ma'am. We got a complaint, and we had to investigate." "Investigate?" My wife laughed, the sound echoing through the hallway. "Really? Over a mailbox and a fence? Do you even know how ridiculous this sounds?" At that moment, I couldn't help but feel a little satisfaction. The power that the HOA thought they had. the control they tried to exert over us. It was all crumbling in front of my eyes. These two officers were clearly uncomfortable, and it was starting to feel like the tables had turned. I watched as my wife took a step forward, walking past the officers and into the living room. She was a force to be reckoned with when she was in uniform, and right now, I could see she was ready to take control of this situation. "Officers," she said, her voice calm but authoritative, "I think it's time we made a few calls." She reached for her phone, dialed a number, and then raised it to her ear. As she spoke to whoever was on the other end, the officers exchanged glances, clearly out of their depth. "Yeah, I'm going to need a report on this HOA complaint, the one about the mailbox, and I want a full report on their violation process," she said. "It's time someone looked into how they're handling these complaints. This isn't normal." The officers didn't respond. They just stood there, looking like they were waiting for permission to leave. My wife was no longer talking to them. She was talking to someone else entirely. Someone who could help expose just how absurd this situation had become. A few minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. I could feel the tension in the room building. The officers were caught between a rock and a hard place, one where they didn't have the power to do anything without being called out on their ridiculous involvement in something so petty. Finally, my wife ended the call and looked at the officers. "I've got a contact at the HOA," she said, her voice now cool and steady, "and I've just asked them to review the case. You can let them know I'll be personally handling it from here." The younger officer opened his mouth, probably to protest, but one glance from my wife silenced him. He closed his mouth and nodded. "Thank you, officers," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm now. "I think we're done here." With that, the two officers turned and left, clearly relieved to be out of a situation they had no idea how to handle. As they walked down the driveway, I couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. But the feeling didn't last long. As the officers got into their car and drove off, I looked at my wife, still processing what had just happened. She turned to me, her face serious again. "This isn't over. You know that, right?" I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "They've crossed the line this time," she said, her tone darkening. "The HOA thought they could push us around. But they didn't count on me showing up. They're going to regret making this a bigger issue than it should have been." I didn't realize it at the time, but that was just the beginning. I thought that would be the end of it, that maybe the HOA would back off, seeing that we weren't the kind of people who would let them run all over us. But I was wrong. What followed was far worse than I could have imagined. The next few days were a blur of more threats, letters, and fines. The HOA wasn't about to let one little incident slide, especially when their authority had been questioned. But my wife, she wasn't backing down. She was on the phone with lawyers, contacting neighbors, and gathering evidence that the HOA was overstepping its bounds. The more we fought, the worse it got. It was like the HOA had declared war, and now we were right in the middle of it. It didn't take long for them to escalate things, but that's when the real chaos began. The fine letters started coming in faster than I could read them, and they weren't just about the mailbox anymore. The HOA was now attacking everything: our fence, the paint color, even the way we trimmed the bushes in the front yard. I had no idea how deep this was going to go, but I knew one thing for sure. The HOA had made a mistake by pushing us this far. But what would happen next? Would my wife be able to turn the tide? Or would the HOA's power trip push us to the edge? Do you think this HOA was just flexing their muscles, or do they have something bigger planned? Things went from bad to worse in what felt like the blink of an eye. The HOA thought they were in control. They had the power to issue complaints, fine people, and basically run the neighborhood as if they owned it. I'd always thought it was a bit much, But when they showed up at my door with police in tow, I knew this was something bigger than just a misplaced lawn chair or a hedge that was too high. But I never thought they'd take it this far. It started the morning after the officers left. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through emails, when I heard a loud thud at the door. Another letter from the HOA, no doubt. My wife had already made it clear she wasn't going to let them win, but I wasn't. I was ready for what was in that letter. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a new notice, even more aggressive than the last one. It wasn't just about the mailbox anymore. This one was full of new violations. First, there was a fine for the color of my fence again. Apparently, the HOA had decided that my fence, still the same shade it had been for the past 5 years, was now an unacceptable color. The letter specifically said, "It does not align with the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood." Next, they had gone after my lawn again. My grass had been too thick in some areas, too sparse in others. They wanted me to reseed the entire lawn, and of course, they'd slap another fine on top of it. But the worst part? They had now started to demand that I repaint my house. I stood there, staring at the letter in disbelief. Repaint my house? What were they even talking about? There was nothing wrong with the color of the house. It was a neutral, pleasant beige, nothing out of the ordinary. But there it was. They were pushing every button they could, trying to get under my skin. I crumpled the letter in my hand and tossed it aside. I was done playing nice. This wasn't about property values anymore. It was about control. And they were trying to take it all. I went outside, wanting to clear my head. I looked at the house, the yard, the fence, and I saw it clearly for the first time. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. That's when I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. The door. Another visitor? Could it be the HOA again? Or was it something worse? I opened the door, expecting maybe another officer or a neighbor trying to act like they were enforcing the HOA's will. But it wasn't an officer. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a man in a suit. He looked official, like someone who could actually get things done. He stepped forward, flashing a polite smile, but his eyes didn't match the kindness in his expression. There was something cold about them. "I'm Mr. Carter," he said, holding out his hand. "I'm with the HOA's legal department. I'd like to discuss the violations and fines you've received." I stared at him, my mind racing. Legal department? Now, they were bringing in lawyers? This had gone from bad to dangerous. "Legal department?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've got to be kidding me. I've already dealt with your fines and complaints. What now?" Mr. Carter stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to resolve this quickly. The fines have already been issued, but if you don't take action, there could be serious consequences. The HOA has decided to escalate this matter." "Escalate?" I repeated. My anger flared. "You've got to be joking. I'm not repainting my house, I'm not fixing my mailbox, and I'm not reseeding my lawn for nothing." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "The HOA has the power to take legal action. You should be aware of that. If this continues, we will move forward with formal proceedings." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The HOA was actually talking about legal action over some petty complaints about my mailbox and the color of my house. It felt like a nightmare that was spiraling out of control. I looked at my wife, who had walked in behind me. She took one glance at Mr. Carter and then back at me. I could see the wheels turning in her head. She wasn't the kind of person who backed down from a fight. She was a police officer, and she was used to dealing with bigger problems than a bunch of HOA fines. "We'll handle this," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You can take your legal threats and leave," Mr. Carter rapped. Raised an eyebrow. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. The HOA doesn't just back down. We'll be sending a team to inspect your property in the next week. If things aren't resolved, we will proceed with legal action." I stared at him, trying to process everything. Legal action over a fence? Over a mailbox? This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was about something else, something personal. It had to be. As Mr. Carter left, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. This wasn't going to be over any time soon. The HOA wasn't backing down, and it seemed like they were more determined than ever to make our lives miserable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on, something bigger. There was no way they were just this petty. There had to be something more behind this. I turned to my wife, who was already pulling out her phone. She was making calls, getting to work. I knew she wasn't going to let this slide, but even she looked worried. She was right, though. This was about to escalate, and there was no telling how far it would go. The HOA had crossed a line, and they weren't going to stop until they'd made us pay. As the days passed, the tension grew. The HOA's lawyers were now involved, sending more and more letters. The fines kept piling up, and it felt like the walls were closing in on us. But I wasn't ready to just roll over and give in. This wasn't just about fines. This wasn't just about property violations. This was a war now, and it was one I wasn't going to lose. So the question remains, do you think the HOA will back down? Or is this just the beginning of an all-out war? It's funny how things can change in the blink of an eye. One minute you're dealing with something as ridiculous as a mailbox being too high, and the next, the entire neighborhood feels like it's turning into a battleground. The HOA wasn't just being petty anymore. They were playing for keeps. And I was stuck right in the middle of it. The moment that Mr. Carter left our house with his empty threats about legal action, I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. The HOA had crossed a line, but what could I do? They had lawyers, resources, and most importantly, the power to make my life miserable. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was the one thing they'd underestimated: my wife. She'd been quiet for the past few hours, which was unusual. She was always the one who took charge, the one who made things happen. But now, as the weight of the situation grew, she seemed to be deep in thought, her eyes focused on something far away. I could see she was making plans I had no idea about. Then the phone rang. I watched as she picked it up, her face lighting up with a look of determination I hadn't seen in a long time. She listened intently, nodding as the person on the other end spoke. Her hand tightened around the phone, and I could tell something big was happening. She hung up, her expression now serious. "They're about to get a taste of their own medicine," she said, her voice calm, but there was something about it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean?" I asked, still processing everything that had happened with Mr. Carter and the threats of legal action. She looked at me and smiled. "You'll see." Before I could ask anything else, she turned and walked to the door. I followed her, wondering what she had in mind. As she grabbed her keys, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was planning something big, something that would make the HOA regret ever stepping foot in our lives. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" I asked, a little concerned now. She didn't answer immediately, just gave me a look. It was the kind of look that said she was about to do something I wouldn't understand. But that was okay. "Just trust me," she said. And before I could protest, she was out the door. I stood there for a moment, watching her leave, wondering what she had planned. It wasn't like her to just take off without saying much. But there was something about the way she'd said those words, "You'll see," that made me think something huge was coming. The next few hours dragged on. My mind raced with possibilities. What was she doing? Why did she leave so suddenly? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, but I had no idea what. Then, the knock came. Another knock, but this time it was different. It wasn't the soft, polite knock from the officers or a delivery guy. This one was sharp, demanding, just like the one from the day the HOA had sent the cops to my house. I opened the door, half expecting to see another lawyer or some other HOA representative trying to enforce their ridiculous rules. But no, it wasn't them. Standing at the door was my wife. But she wasn't in her usual clothes. She was in her full police uniform. I blinked, not sure if I was seeing things. She had never come home in her uniform after work. But here she was, standing in front of me, looking every bit the part of a police officer. Her expression was serious, and her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity I hadn't seen before. "What are you doing?" I asked, still in shock. "I need to make a statement," she replied, her voice calm, but with a sharp edge to it. Before I could ask anything else, she stepped past me and into the living room, as if she had every right to be there. She didn't even look back. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to catch up to her. She turned to face me, a look of quiet confidence in her eyes. "The HOA thinks they can bully us," she said, her words slow but deliberate. "But I'm going to show them that we don't back down." I was still trying to process everything. My wife, my tough, no-nonsense wife, was about to do something. But what? The doorbell rang again, cutting off my thoughts. My heart skipped a beat. Who else could be here now? Had the HOA sent someone else to try to intimidate us? I walked over to the door and opened it. This time it was Mr. Carter, the lawyer from the HOA, standing in front of me, looking a little too smug for my liking. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold. "The HOA isn't going to let this slide, and you need to understand that. Legal action is coming, whether you like it or not." But before I could say anything, my wife stepped up behind me, her presence instantly shifting the atmosphere in the room. She stood tall in her uniform, her badge gleaming under the lights. She wasn't the woman who'd just been dealing with paperwork and complaints. She was the woman in charge. "You don't scare me," she said to Mr. Carter, her voice firm. "You've crossed the line and I'm done playing games." Mr. Carter's eyes flickered to her badge, then back to me. For a moment it seemed like he was unsure of what to do, but then he quickly regained his composure. "We'll see you in court," he said, his tone almost threatening as he turned to leave. But my wife wasn't finished. "Make sure you bring your best lawyer," she called after him, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to echo through the air, "because we're not going down without a fight." As Mr. Carter walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. My wife wasn't just a police officer, she was a force to be reckoned with, and the HOA was about to realize just how badly they had underestimated her. But this wasn't Ovi. The HOA might have thought they were in control, but they had no idea what was coming next. So, as the tension in the air thickened, I couldn't help but wonder, what was the HOA going to do next? Did they really think they could win a battle like this? The air felt thick with tension. My wife's words still echoed in my mind. We're not going down without a fight. It wasn't just a promise. It was a declaration. And suddenly, I wasn't the only one feeling the heat of the HOA's power trip. This wasn't about the mailbox or the lawn anymore. This was about something bigger, something personal. And we were about to throw the first punch. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and a stack of papers on the kitchen table. My wife was already on the phone, her voice low and steady as she spoke to someone I couldn't quite hear. I poured myself a cup and sat down, trying to piece together what was happening. It had only been a day since Mr. Carter showed up with his threats of legal action, and already my wife had launched into full gear. She'd spent hours last night gathering evidence, making calls, and even reaching out to some of the neighbors who'd been pushed around by the HOA over the years. But today was different. Today, The HOA would see that they were up against more than just a homeowner. They were up against a woman who wasn't afraid to fight for what was right. My wife hung up the phone and turned to me, her expression serious. They've crossed the line, and now they're going to pay for it. I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. I'd never seen her like this before. Calm, collected, but with a fire in her eyes that made me believe she was ready to go to war. "What's the plan?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the whirlwind of thoughts spinning in my head. "We hit them where it hurts," she said. "We're going public." I raised an eyebrow. "Public? You mean like in the news?" She nodded. "Exactly. It's time to let everyone know how the HOA is operating, how they're using their power to bully people and enforce ridiculous rules. We're going to expose them for what they really are." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd always known the HOA was shady, but this was different. This was about taking them down for good. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the strategy coming together like a well-oiled machine. She wasn't just going to fight the HOA with paperwork and legal threats. She was going to make sure the whole neighborhood knew exactly who they were dealing with. I couldn't help but feel a little awestruck. My wife wasn't just some cop in a uniform. She was a woman on a mission, and nothing was going to stop her now. That afternoon, we made a call to a local news station. They had been covering stories about overzealous HOAs for months. And this was something they couldn't ignore. We told them everything: the fines, the complaints, the ridiculous rules. We even included the story of how the HOA had sent the cops to our door over a mailbox. Within hours, we were scheduled for an interview. When the news crew arrived, it was like something out of a movie. The cameras were set up, the lights shining brightly, and reporters rushing around trying to make sure everything was perfect. It was surreal. But my wife, standing there in her uniform, didn't flinch. She was calm, collected, and ready to take down the HOA in front of the entire neighborhood. The reporter gave her the floor, and she didn't waste a second. "The HOA has been abusing their power for far too long," she began, her voice clear and confident. "They've been fining residents for ridiculous reasons, things that have nothing to do with the well-being of this community. And when someone dares to challenge them, they resort to threats and intimidation." I watched as the camera zoomed in on her face, capturing every word she said. The words power and intimidation seemed to hang in the air, and I could feel the shift in the room. The neighborhood's dirty secret was out, and the HOA wasn't going to like it one bit. "We've been dealing with this for years," she continued, "but no one has dared to speak up. Until now." As the interview wrapped up, I could see the reporter's eyes widen. This wasn't just another story. It was a bombshell. The HOA had no idea what they were in for. But as the crew packed up and left, I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen next? Just as the last of the equipment was being packed into the van, my phone buzzed. It was a message from one of our neighbors. "Did you just go public?" I smiled. It was working. The neighborhood was starting to wake up. They were finally seeing the HOA for what it was: a power-hungry group of people who thought they could control everyone's lives. But as I looked at my wife, standing tall beside me, I knew we weren't done. We had only just begun. And just as I was about to ask her what the next step was, my phone rang again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. I answered, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mr. Johnson?" It was Mr. Carter, the HOA lawyer. "We've seen the news," he said, his voice cold. "And now, you've made this personal." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked at my wife, who was watching me closely. She was ready for whatever came next. "Well, Carter, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You've got your wish. This is personal now. I hung up the phone and turned to my wife. She gave me a small nod, and I could see the determination in her eyes. The HOA might have thought they could intimidate us. They might have thought they were untouchable. But now they had no idea what was coming. So, what's your take on this situation? Do you think the HOA will back off after going public, or is this just the beginning of something much bigger? I had never been a fan of drama. I liked things calm, straightforward, and easy to manage. But I could feel that everything was spiraling out of control now. The moment we went public, it was like opening a door that couldn't be closed. The HOA was furious. And when Mr. Carter called, I knew the gloves were off. Things were about to get a lot messier. The day after the news segment aired, the neighborhood felt different. There was an electricity in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA wasn't going to take this lying down. They had been caught in the act, and now they were in full-on damage control mode. I woke up to an unexpected message that morning. You've gone too far. It was from one of the board members of the HOA. The message was short, to the point, and felt like a warning. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or be worried. The HOA was threatening us? After all the lies, the fines, and the ridiculous complaints, they thought they had the moral high ground? I showed the message to my wife, and she simply smiled. Let them think they still have control. The worst they can do is send more letters, and trust me, they will. Her confidence was reassuring, but it didn't calm the knot in my stomach. Something told me that they were going to escalate things further, and we weren't ready for what that might look like. That afternoon, we got the first sign of retaliation. A letter from the HOA arrived, but this wasn't any ordinary letter. It wasn't another fine for the mailbox or the law, and this one was different. It was a cease and desist letter. The HOA was demanding that we remove all the content related to them from the news. They were claiming that it was a violation of their reputation and privacy. They said they would pursue legal action if we didn't comply. I stared at the letter, unable to believe what I was reading. Was this how low they had sunk? Now they were threatening to take us to court over a news segment that showed how they had been harassing residents? I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. They were the ones who had crossed every line imaginable. Now they wanted to silence us? My wife, of course, didn't seem the least bit fazed. She crumpled the letter in her hand, tossing it aside like it was nothing more than a piece of junk mail. We're not taking it down. Let them sue us. We've got the truth on our side. I agreed with her. There was no way we were backing down now. The neighborhood needed to know the truth. The HOA needed to understand that they couldn't control us anymore. But then, as I started to relax a bit, the next surprise hit. A few days later, I was at work when I received a call. It was from one of my neighbors. "They're here," he said, his voice strained. "The HOA sent contractors to your house. They're measuring your lawn and your fence." I felt my stomach drop. What were they doing? Were they trying to find another way to fine us? Or were they just looking for any excuse to continue the harassment? I hung up the phone quickly and called my wife. She answered almost immediately, sounding unusually calm. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice thick with concern. "They're here too," she said. "The contractors are measuring everything. I just talked to one of them. They said they're here to inspect the property for more violations." I couldn't believe it. After everything we'd already gone through, the HOA was now sending people onto our property to inspect it? This was becoming more and more like an invasion. I rushed home, my mind racing with all the possible scenarios. The HOA was now blatantly trying to push us into a corner, giving us no room to breathe. When I arrived, I found the contractors standing in the front yard, holding measuring tapes and clipboards. They looked at me, then went back to their work as if nothing had happened. My wife was standing by the door, her arms crossed, watching them closely. "What do you think they're doing?" I asked her, my eyes narrowing at the workers. "They're looking for anything. The height of the fence, the color of the house, the way the lawn is cut, everything. They're hoping they'll find something they can fine us for," she said, her voice calm, but filled with a simmering anger. I walked up to one of the contractors, trying to keep my tone level. "What's going on here?" I asked. "Why are you here measuring my property?" One of them looked at me, clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't back down. "We were instructed by the HOA to perform an inspection. They want to make sure everything is up to code." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The HOA had gone this far just to make sure we followed every rule to the letter? It was clear that they were trying to find something, anything, to punish us for challenging them. But here's where it got interesting. As I stood there, watching the contractors, I realized something. They weren't just measuring random parts of the property. They were focusing on one specific area, the mailbox. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. They were still obsessed with that stupid mailbox. I walked over to my wife, who was watching from the porch. She was already making calls, and it was clear she was about to turn up the heat even more. "Don't worry about this," she said, giving me a reassuring smile. "They can measure all they want. We've got enough evidence to bury them." And she was right. They could send contractors, they could send lawyers. But we had something they didn't, the truth. But as we stood there, watching the contractors finish their work, I couldn't help but wonder, what would they do next? Were they really willing to take this all the way to court? Or was this just their last attempt at scaring us into submission? If I thought things couldn't get any crazier, I was wrong. The HOA's response had been escalating for weeks, but what happened next? That was something I never saw coming. It was the middle of the week when it all boiled over. My wife had just finished a meeting with our lawyer about the contractors showing up unannounced, measuring our lawn, fence, and mailbox again, despite everything we'd done to comply. We were done being patient, done being pushed around. The fight had gone on long enough, and we were finally preparing for the final blow. I was at work when the email arrived. At first, I thought it was just another letter, another petty threat from the HOA to add to the pile. But as I read the words on the screen, I felt my heart drop into my stomach. It was a court summons. The HOA wasn't playing games anymore. They were taking us to court. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what was happening. We'd fought back, we'd gone public, but now they were pulling out all the stops. They had lawyers, resources, and endless time to grind us into submission. The fight we were in wasn't about petty fines anymore. This was about winning, and the HOA was playing for keeps. I immediately called my wife. She answered after the second ring. "Babe, we need to talk," I said, my voice tight. "The HOA, they just filed a lawsuit against us." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then she spoke, her voice low but resolute. "I already know." I froze. "What do you mean, you know?" "I knew it was coming," she said, calm as ever. "But they don't understand what they're up against." It was surreal. Here we were, about to face off in court with the very people who had been terrorizing us for months over things like mailbox height and lawn color. The thought of it felt absurd. But my wife wasn't worried. If anything, her confidence only grew with each passing minute. "What's the plan?" I asked, trying to keep up. I could tell she was already thinking several steps ahead. "We fight back. We expose them. Everything they've done. Every violation, every fine, every shady tactic they've used. We put it all on the table. And we don't stop until they know they've lost." Her words were like a spark to dry kindling. It was no longer about defending our house or yard. This was about ending their reign of terror. And we had something they didn't: evidence. The neighbors, the contractors, the news segment, everything was lining up in our favor. But as we prepared for court, the HOA wasn't going to sit quietly. They had one last trick up their sleeves. The very next day, we received a letter from the HOA's lawyer. It wasn't about fines. It wasn't about property violations. No, this one was something different. It was a character defamation suit. They claimed that the news segment, the one that had exposed their petty practices, had damaged their reputation in the community. They were demanding that we retract everything we'd said on camera and issue an apology. If we didn't, they threatened to add defamation charges to the lawsuit. I laughed when I saw it. The audacity was unreal. The HOA had caused so much damage to our lives, and now they wanted us to apologize? To them? I showed the letter to my wife, who read it carefully before tossing it aside. "They're desperate," she said, barely hiding a smile. "They've got nothing left, and they know it." But that didn't stop them. The night before the court hearing, we received an unexpected visitor. A man knocked on our door dressed in a suit. He introduced himself as one of the HOA's negotiators and said they were willing to settle out of court if we agreed to their terms. The terms were simple. We would agree to remove all public content about the HOA, retract our statements, and pay a fine for the supposed violation of their reputation. I'll admit, part of me wanted to hear him out. It seemed like a way to end it all, to walk away without the headache of a trial. But then, I looked at my wife. She had already made up her mind. "We're not backing down," she said, her voice unwavering. "Tell them we'll see them in court." The negotiator didn't even blink. He nodded and left without a word. I had no idea if he was expecting us to cave in, but there was no way we were giving them the satisfaction. Court day arrived, and it felt like the calm before the storm. I'd never been in a courtroom before, but walking into that place, knowing we were up against the HOA, was a strange feeling. It wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about sending a message. It was about showing them and everyone else that you didn't have to roll over when they tried to take control of your life. The courtroom was packed with people. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had heard about our case and wanted to see how it would unfold. There was a buzz in the air, a sense that everyone knew this wasn't just a small case. This was a battle between the little guy and the powerful forces of a corrupt system. The HOA's lawyers were already sitting at the front, their faces stone cold. Mr. Carter, the same lawyer who had made those threats weeks ago, was sitting there, looking at us with a smug expression. But there was one thing he didn't count on: my wife. As soon as we entered, she stood tall and straight, walking confidently to our seats. She didn't look at the opposing side, didn't flinch at the intimidation tactics. She was ready. The case began, and the evidence started piling up. We had documents, photographs, and testimonies from neighbors. Every little thing the HOA had done, every illegal fine, every threat, every overstep, was put out in front of the judge. But the twist came when our lawyer called in the final witness, one of the HOA board members. They'd been secretly gathering information from the inside, and what they revealed was enough to knock the HOA off its feet. The board had been operating outside the rules for years, abusing their power in ways they'd never thought would be exposed. The courtroom fell silent. The HOA had been caught in the act. As the judge adjourned, I couldn't help but feel a rush of victory. But one question lingered in my mind: do you think the HOA will ever recover from this?